Now, the way I understand it, you guys have introduced some legislation about gun control. Tell me about it.
Well, the first thing I'd say is it's not about gun control. It's about gun safety and trying to reduce gun violence. So we have a number of bills out, one that I've had out for 6, maybe 8 years on basically closing the loophole on background checks so that everyone has to go through a background check, with a few exceptions like guns that might be passed down in a family. But right now, we have probably 40% of guns that are used in commission of crimes are guns that are obtained illegally.
I think it's important for folks to realize that when we talk about common sense gun reform, we're not anti-gun. In fact, what we recognize is that there's a public health crisis in the state of Wisconsin and in fact across our whole country. And the legislation that we support and sponsor is actually supported by the vast majority of people across Wisconsin. And it's because of huge amounts of money that have come in spent on behalf of special interest groups that people may question that. But when you ask folks individually, do you support more safety? Do you support common sense reforms to address this public health crisis? The vast majority of people in Wisconsin stand on the side of making changes.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about safety versus control. I'm going to ask you some more questions about that. But let me start out and let's go back a little bit and let's start this more general. So let me ask, if I were to say to you, what is it Americans love? And I ask that question of you, and let's say, would you say, answer might be football. They might like ice cream, or they might like freedom, or they might like television, they might like making money. What would you say the answer would be? What do you think, in your own personal opinion, nothing to do with legislation, what do you think Americans love?
For me, I think Americans love the fact that they can dream of a better tomorrow, that they can believe that our actions today will be planting seeds for a more prosperous, a more safe, a more secure country for our kids to grow up in.
Okay.
And I would say ditto, but I would also say that family. The family unit is something that people very much value, and they, as Melissa said, the future of their kids is very important. And so that their kids, I think we still have this value that we want our kids and our grandchildren to have at least as good a life, but probably a better life than we did, and that their hopes and dreams are realized. So I think there's a real value that people hold in our country around protecting their children, nurturing their children, having high hopes for their children.
Okay. You didn't say football, and I think that's a very safe answer. That's a universal answer. I mean, to say that people want a better future and they want they value family. I also noticed you didn't say guns, although I believe, according to current stats, there are more than 3 million guns in the United States, and I think it comes to about 1 per person.
Mm-hmm. I think.
Well, and quite frankly, maybe it comes to 1 per person, but and I don't have the statistics in front of me as we have this conversation, but my understanding is that the people that own guns own a lot of guns, mm-hmm. and then there's a lot of people that don't own any guns, right?
Yeah. So it's not every person has a gun, yes. But it's the highest per capita ownership, more guns in the U.S. than per capita than any country in the world. So I would add that Americans seem to love guns quite a bit. And so one of the things we're going to talk about here is what I would call gun culture. And you guys have introduced some legislation about safety. But we have in America a gun culture where Americans truly do love their firearms. And so we are going to, in this conversation, talk about quite a bit of things about guns, and safety will be among them. So first thing I want to say is, if I were to look at the research, I noticed that when we talk about what's effective in terms of guns, one of the things that is not highly mentioned is talking about gun safety. One of the more effective things that the statistics would argue is more policing, better policing. More police presence would reduce gun violence. But you have mentioned something very interesting. You said that you'd like to see the way that, I want to ask you to correct me on this and to refine this, but the way that guns are, is it registered, or how they are recorded? Because currently, true or false, right now, in America, the Brady Bill says if you're a gun dealer, you have to make sure that there's a background check, and those guns have to be registered. But if it's a one-to-one sale, you don't have to do that, right? That's the way it works. Is that correct?
So that's straw purchases that you're talking about in particular.
Well, and there's a lot that's done over the internet or back of, I saw some kids in Walgreens one day looking at the back of a magazine, and I was curious, and I discovered there were gun ads in the back of that magazine. People who, sell out of the trunks of their cars. I have heard that there are people who buy from retailers and they buy a license. They buy from a licensed dealer, but they buy multiple guns. And as you mentioned, there are people who own quite a few guns. I had a family member who had something like 32 guns, and all he did was go turkey and deer hunting once a year. Anyway, so there's lots of ways to get guns without going through a licensed dealer. And a lot of people are doing that because they know they can't pass the federal check. So it's real easy to find somebody who's selling. You can look in Madison newspapers, probably newspapers throughout the state, and see people who are selling guns. So.
Why is it a problem? Why do guns need to be registered in the first place? Why can't somebody sell out of the trunk of their car?
Well, imagine a crime. Imagine being a police officer and you're trying to investigate a crime, and a gun was part of committing this crime. A lot of the guns, when I talk to police officers in our community that are being used in crimes, are actually guns that have been stolen. And we don't have any regulations in Wisconsin that would say if you had a gun and it was stolen from you, that you need to report that. So if these firearms, for example, that were stolen, that are being used in crimes, had been reported, it might make the jobs easier for our police officers to be able to trace this back. So that's an example of common sense gun reform, and an example of how it is that, quite frankly, doesn't even address this straw purchase. But it's a way that people are gaining access to firearms in our communities, and it's happening every single day. People are driving around in their cars with guns under the seats or in their glove boxes. Their cars are broken into, and these are one of the first things that people are actually looking for. They're targeting in these auto theft, when they're crashing into people's cars and breaking their windows and looking for these firearms. But there are also people out there. Therese talked about they may not be able to qualify for a background check, but someone has a firearm that they want to complete their collection. And they would qualify for a background check, but we don't require that. And you don't know where that firearm, how many hands has that firearm traveled through between the time that it was being sold by someone who legitimately could be someone who is selling firearm and being purchased by someone who can purchase a firearm, right? There's no way to trace the paths of these firearms. So it makes it very complicated and confusing for folks to help make safety and security in our communities.
Okay, now we've mentioned safety and we've mentioned crime, but we haven't mentioned the elephant in the room here, and that's the word violence. I mean, a lot of this comes down to the fact that we're talking about gun violence here, because statistics also bear out the fact that if there are more guns, there is the chance, the higher likelihood that there is more violence. I mean, guns kill more effectively than knives do. And we've all heard the expression that guns don't kill people, but they sure do make the job a lot easier, according to those statistics, therefore. And so we are talking about, Clare, Wisconsin. Last year, a man broke into a house and shot a woman, and when he was asked why he did it, he said that he believed she was a demon. and that she ate children. This last summer, we had a man shoot his wife and himself. So we have the issue of crime as related to robbery and gang violence, and we also have domestic abuse. Now, in the state of Wisconsin, like other places around America, we have the great freedom to bear arms, but it seems we also have the freedom to abuse arms. Is that what you're looking at in this legislation too, then?
Well, I would say that one of the questions you asked before is the proliferation of guns a problem? And I think you cited the statistics that basically we know that if a gun is available, then there's more likely to be a death. For instance, if someone is in a home where there's domestic violence and somebody owns a gun, there's more likely to be a domestic violence death by gun than if there wasn't a gun in that household. Teen suicide is a really, really tragic thing that is enhanced by a gun being in the home. Teens at a very emotional time in their development may be distraught, may be suffering early signs of depression, or may be distraught over a breakup. They don't really have a sense of mortality as such. If there's a gun in the house, they are more likely to use it to commit suicide. In Wisconsin, we have a significant problem with the number of child deaths that are accidental, where a child finds a gun or a sister or brother finds a gun and accidentally shoots a sibling. And the last statistic I saw, we were up by 31%, I think, in 2016, whereas the rest of the nation was down by 7%. So I don't know why there'd be that big of a differential between Wisconsin and other states, but if there are guns in a house that are unsecured, then it's more likely that children will, no matter, and I think everybody's probably seen a very famous video of kids who were told not to touch any guns in a room, and the parents all watched behind a window, and then when the person left the room and the kids were left alone with the guns, they started touching the guns. So, with guns around, there's more of a likelihood that they will be used in one manner or another. It's not just hunting, and that's what ends up being so tragic, is the deaths that come at the hands of kids that are accident suicides, or as we saw Newtown, a very troubled young boy who should never have been given guns by his mother, taking a gun and deciding that one way to make sense of his life, I guess at the time, was to kill 20 school kids and 6 teachers. So if there's no gun around, that can't happen. The more guns that are around, the greater the likelihood, and that makes sense. So we're saying, let's concentrate on safety. Let's concentrate on, locking guns up. Let's concentrate on getting them out of the hands of people who are likely to use them for violence on the streets. Let's try and get them out of the hands of people who have severe mental illness and may not be able to make good judgments. So that's, I think, where we need to concentrate, because if we talk about getting rid of guns, well, that's the fear that has driven a lot of the purchases of guns by the average citizen, is some idea that they are going to be in danger from a criminal element or terrorist or whatever, and that they consequently need to have that gun. And the more we build that fear, the more guns there's going to be. So if we're going to have the guns, let's learn to be responsible, because I think everybody believes in a safe community, and everybody wants to keep their children alive.
Let me ask this of you here now. Let's say we're talking about less guns. I'm getting that sense that we're talking about, well, we both agree, more guns mean there could be more violence. But if we're talking about less guns, in a country where there are in excess of 3 million guns, a few thousand guns doesn't make much difference. It doesn't make a difference. And in fact, it's shown again statistically that if you're talking about gun collections or trade-ins of guns, that doesn't affect much what's happening in terms of gun violence. But let's talk about another part of that, mental illness. Now, right now, if I am suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and I'm on medication and I buy a gun, what happens if I go off that medication? Or what happens if I'm never registered in the first place as mentally ill and I have some symptoms and I buy a gun? Do we have anything in the state right now that addresses that?
So there have been a number of different states that have actually had conversations about gun violence restraining orders and the impact of allowing folks to remove guns from situations that may be explosive. So maybe someone is in the middle of a mental health crisis. Maybe there's been a concern that there's going to be self-harm, or there's been a history of domestic violence. And legislation has been proposed in other communities that would allow the guns to be removed from that situation because someone that is aware notifies the officials. And I'm currently working on legislation, and we've had that legislation proposed over previous sessions. Now, quite frankly, in Wisconsin, we're moving in the opposite direction. We have colleagues that have introduced legislation that would take away training requirements in order to conceal carry. And that would take away the importance of having a license to have guns. And that moves us in a direction that's not more safe and quite frankly is very concerning to me for the people that have experienced gun violence. This is a real thing. It's a public health crisis. We need to be addressing this. Across the nation, it's about 2/3 of gun deaths and injury is related to self-harm. In Wisconsin, I think the statistics are closer to 3/4 of guns hurting people is self-inflicted. So we absolutely need to not forget to have this conversation about the fact that gun violence can mean suicide. And oftentimes people aren't talking about that because of the stigma associated with mental health crisis, the stigma associated with suicide. So providing the people in our communities the ability to report that there may be a gun and that they're concerned about how that gun may be used because there is a crisis of one type or another that's occurring, and allowing that removal of a gun in a safe way. And people can earn the privilege of having that gun back after things are stabilized is really important. And we need to be having tough conversations because, quite frankly, my goal is not to take guns away from people in the state of Wisconsin. My family owns guns. My kids and husband hunt and shoot guns on a regular basis. There are guns in my house. And I think that it's important that we have pragmatic conversations and understand the importance of education, the importance of fair and balanced regulation. That's part of how it is that we make sure that folks can use guns in a responsible way, but that we make sure that we're removing guns from situations that can cause harm, not only on ourselves, but on other people around us.
I want to make sure I understand this, Melissa. No, you say you're not taking guns away, but in another sentence you did say you were taking guns away from people who are mentally ill. If they weren't capable of using guns properly, they maybe shouldn't have those guns and they should be taken away from them.
If there's a concern that there's going to be self-harm. I mean, I think that there are examples of people that suffer from mental illness that having a gun is not a bad thing for that person. I think that it's a really dangerous and slippery slope to go down and say that everyone that has a diagnosed mental illness should not be allowed to have a gun. That is not, those are not mutually exclusive.
And yet
of one
the guy in
another.
Eau Claire who broke in with the gun and thought the woman was a demon and ate babies, he was mentally ill and had a gun. So he should not have had a gun in that instance.
He shouldn't have, and neither should have my uncle, who went to his parents' house and took a gun out of the family gun safe and shot his head off. He shouldn't have had a gun either. But that doesn't mean that my 17-year-old son that's gone through hunter safety, that really appreciates and honors our hunting culture and our conservation culture in Wisconsin, shouldn't be allowed to have a gun.
Well, that's where this argument comes down to again, is freedom versus that abuse of freedom. And the abuse of freedom, how we see it, is in gun violence. Now, I want to mention too, now you mentioned a lot of self-inflicted gun deaths, but the U.S. is one of the top nations for homicide rates, and I think maybe Estonia ranks above them in terms of homicide rates. And we all know those homicide rates are guns that are doing it. They're not hand grenades. Of course, there are some knives involved, but those are mostly guns that are doing it. So let's talk about something else you brought up, which is interesting. Are you guys Democrats or Republicans?
Democrats.
Okay, all right. Are you NRA members?
I am not, but I don't hunt.
I'm not, but I have family members that
All
are.
right. Now, we are talking about a very powerful lobbying group, the NRA. And the NRA's opinion is that, boy, gun freedoms are important. In Wisconsin, we do not have a right to nourishment. We don't have a right to being taken care of in our old age. We don't have a right to health, universal health care. We don't have a right to clean air. But we do have the right to carry arms, concealed arms. And so you are fighting a very strong lobbying group that says not only are guns great, but there seems to be no limit to how guns can be used by Americans. I mean, we have that right, and so how dare you put a limit and a ceiling on what that limit should be and how we use guns? You're fighting that every day.
Well, I think a lot of people aren't necessarily thinking about the real factor behind the NRA, which is the gun manufacturers who make a ton of money off of fearful incidents. We had Newtown, gun sales were up all over the nation. Ammunition flying out the doors. People were buying like crazy because they were afraid that there was going to be gun control and that their guns might be taken away. So keeping that fueled is what the NRA is doing, but the backdrop of that is the gun manufacturers are making a ton of money and make a ton of money in our country. So the NRA is fueling that to help the gun manufacturers, and it's a business. We are capitalism. We're capitalists. It's a business, and so we've got this. What we saw after Newtown is something that we see all the time, which is make people afraid, and then tell them that the way to not be afraid is to be armed, and so it helps a particular business. Newtown was, I think, really shocking to a lot of us from the perspective of why didn't that change things? Why didn't that mean enough to people that they might make it a litmus test for politicians if they would start doing something to get more guns out of the hands of people who would use them in the wrong way. And instead we saw the opposite. We've seen a proliferation of loosening of gun ownership restrictions throughout the nation. But on the flip side of that, we have seen organizations growing across the nation and in Wisconsin of citizens who are trying to do something about it because they no longer expect that Congress or legislatures will do anything. And so we've got at least 9 different organizations in the state of Wisconsin that we discovered were working on one element or another, or one perspective or another. And what really made me think about, how do we get all of these people working together, or at least knowing about each other's work, was when I was invited to a Mothers Against Gun Violence meeting in my district. And women were introducing themselves and explaining why they were there. And we get back to the safe communities. Well, even in Madison now and Middleton and surrounding suburbs, if you want to go into an elementary school or high school these days, you have to go through security. This, to me, and to these mothers, sends a horrible message, because every day, when they say goodbye to their kids, they have to think about that. And the women introducing themselves at this meeting, some of them were crying. One woman said, I'm in an interracial relationship. My husband is a Muslim. I have a child. When that child goes off to school, I have to think about whether or not he is personally in any way discriminated against, but I also now have to think about the larger picture. Is somebody going to kill him? Is somebody going to kill his whole classroom? And taking kids to school where you have to press a buzzer and announce yourself and your business, which I had to do yesterday when I went to one of the schools in my district, is like a big billboard that says, the world is different now. Everywhere you go, you have to worry about the possibility that you might get killed or your little kid might be killed. And so I think citizens have given up on the legislature and on Congress. They're not looking to us anymore for that. I mean, they are hoping that eventually, but they're organizing in their communities. The churches are starting to get involved. We have the social workers, any number of groups that are starting to think about how do we counter all this violence and all of the guns, the unneeded guns for people who feel threatened but don't hunt, but seem to think that something bad is going to happen to them. So it's a movement that since Newtown has really been growing, and I think someday it will have an effect, but we have to get to the point where it's a litmus test for politicians, that if they don't support doing something to keep communities safer, to keep kids safe when they go off to school, when they're in their classrooms, that they're going to be held accountable and they're going to lose office.
Okay, several questions from what you just said. First of all, aren't schools safer if we put guns in them? I mean, that's a hot topic in Wisconsin now. Let's put guns in schools. Aren't schools safer if we have guns on the inside?
Absolutely not.
Why not?
So I think it's important for us to each put ourselves in the situation. When Newtown occurred, I had a child in first grade. I can't imagine. I get to go home, and now he's in 5th grade, and I get to hold my baby. And there are parents that can't. And when I go to schools, my kids are still in the public schools here. Whether it's elementary school, middle school, high school, or college, I have a freshman in college. It's a different world. They are taking kids as young as 4K, and they're doing drills where the kids are taping the windows, paper over the windows, and locking doors, and pushing tables, and finding hiding places. This is part of what it is that kids are doing, rather than just having a tornado drill. They're aware that this is something that may happen when they're at school. The level of stress, and that it impacts our kids' ability to learn. No child, no 5-year-old child, or 7-year-old child, or 12-year-old child should have to be worried about whether or not someone's going to come through their school and have a gun. And no teacher should be charged with the responsibility of those 20-some kids in their classroom and be wondering where there's a firearm in their classroom and whether it's secure, or if they have to load it, or who's going to be coming in, and how is it that they secure the door, and how do they keep the kids safe. And quite frankly, introducing a gun into that situation, you're taking the attention away from the kids.
I would talk about reaction time. I mean, expecting that a teacher or somebody who is I don't want to say distracted, but has their attention, on the classroom and on the kids, is suddenly going to quickly whip out their gun.
Well, and let's think about the
It's a
teachers at Newtown, the heroes that were there. They were found huddled over children. If there was a gun in that room, they wouldn't have been finding it. They would have been huddled over the children. That's what we do. My friends that have been trained to be police officers and have spent time in the military, in ways that, being a concealed carry permit holder doesn't even train you for. These are people that have been trained for this type of crisis. I've asked them, what would you do? And their answer is, I would get down and out and I would try to get everyone out. The answer wasn't, I would look for the nearest firearm and figure out how it is that I can use that firearm.
Okay, we've discussed a situation here, and the question is, of course, our schools are not safe because we have people with guns that can come in, enter them, and then put our kids in danger. But the question that occurs to me then, which seems so obvious, is who's responsible for that? I mean, these aren't Saudis coming into the schools. These aren't Afghani people coming in here. These aren't French, Sudanese people coming into our schools. These are Americans coming into our schools. In America, we have Americans coming into the schools with guns. And so the answer is to put more guns on the inside of there to protect those same kids that are being attacked by Americans at our own schools. Is that a little ironic? Don't you think so?
Well, I think it's ironic. We have more people killed by guns every year than terrorists. I think the average now is 33,000 people. I read this just today, actually. 33,000 people a year are killed by guns, and not terrorists killing those 33,000. And another something like 105,000 people are injured, and many of those injuries have lifetime consequences. And I'm trying to think, how many people did we have in the United States killed by terrorists last year?
And I think another statistic that I was reading recently was the number of people that have been soldiers that have been killed in combat is less than the number of people that have been killed by guns right here on our own ground, right? So there's a public health crisis. And it's in our communities, and it's in our schools, and it's in our parks. It's in our places of business. And quite frankly, what we're doing by expanding access to guns is making us less safe. And that's not okay. That's not, this isn't the type of environment that kids should be growing up in. And quite frankly, this is the same type of environment that our government decides they're going to go and insert themselves into in foreign lands when there are that many people that are dying because of weapons, right? But it's happening right here in our own backyard, and we're addressing it 180 degrees in the wrong direction.
So guns are often considered a freedom issue. That's the whole argument. It's a freedom issue. It's in our Constitution. And my question again then would be, are we as Americans a land of the free? Are we exercising a freedom, or are we a nation under siege? Because it seems that way. It seems like we're holding up in our schools, we're holding up in our homes because we're afraid we're going to get attacked. We're afraid even that people are going to take our guns away from us. And it's not really a reasonable fear, in my opinion, because it's so strongly protected anyways. But we have a nation that's curling up into a ball and almost exhibiting a kind of mental illness as a nation in terms of how they view guns and how they believe guns will save them from some threat, from some danger. And yet no other nation in the world seems to feel that way. Why is it Americans are that way?
One thing that I have not thought of till you started asking these questions is, do other countries have something similar to the NRA? In terms of a lobbying organization for gun manufacturers that uses the constant drumbeat of you should be afraid, you should be afraid, you need a gun, you need a gun. They're gonna take them away and then you won't be safe, etc. That constant drumbeat, combined with all the money they put into campaigns to support people who will support that viewpoint. So that might be one thing that separates us from other countries, is that we do have that big, we have a big industry with a lobbyist that keeps fueling the fear. And we have people who have a lot going on in their lives. They might have economic challenges. Maybe, we know that there are people who are struggling to stay in the middle class or get in the middle class, and then at the same time they're hearing about terrorists and they're hearing about mass murderers, going into a school and killing 20 kids. And so I think we've got, the fear factor is continually drummed into people, nonstop. What we don't have, and what I would argue is starting now with groups like Moms Against Gun Violence, is people who aren't afraid to talk about it in communities, who are going to start saying, we don't want to live this way. And we need more people to be talking about that and about the right to feel safe when you go to a movie or you go to a mall or you go to any public place. You go to a city and you're walking down a busy street, and people want to feel safe, and we should start talking more about the right to feel safe in your community and your right to live your life and not be in fear everywhere you go. There are people who have unreasonable fears, but at the same, because I know statistically maybe you go to a movie and you're not going to be shot, but just the concept now that people know that has happened, could happen. And then you have an industry and a lobbying group that fuels that fear, that you better go out and get a gun, which, tell me how that's going to help you when you're busy watching a movie and suddenly somebody comes in, or you're at a picnic in somebody's yard in Milwaukee and somebody drives by and shoots and the bullet accidentally hits and kills your child. That's happened in Milwaukee. What exactly does the proliferation of everyone having a gun help in either one of those situations? But instead, we're all living in fear because it is that constant drumbeat.
Well, it seems to me it should be rather common sense, but I got to ask you, are Americans an unintelligent people? Because, they do know that guns are dangerous. They do know that they fire bullets, right? And they do know that if you point one at yourself or at somebody else, it can kill them. They do know that if there are a lot of guns around and a lot of automatic weapons around, they can fire a lot of bullets.
Well,
They know that, right?
They do know that. And quite frankly, the vast majority of Americans and Wisconsinites agree with Teresa and I that what it is that is happening legislatively doesn't match what it is that they value and what it is that they believe we should be doing as a state and as a nation. But we also live in a time where policy is hugely impacted by special interest dollars. So there are a handful arm lengths of examples that I'm sure that Teresa and I could list off in addition to guns, where special interest groups have influenced policy in a way that's opposite of what it is that the people of our communities are asking for. The vast majority of people in Wisconsin believe in background checks. The vast majority of the people in Wisconsin believe we need to close the gun show loophole. The vast majority of the people in Wisconsin believe that we should have waiting periods. Responsible gun owners don't have a problem with responsible gun laws. The people that have a problem with responsible gun laws is the NRA. And those aren't the people that have voted for us. And we are seeing more and more examples of this. It's not just when it comes to gun safety. That policy in our state capitals and quite frankly in Washington, D.C. is being influenced by special interest groups as opposed to being driven by ordinary people on main streets across our communities.
There's another thought that I have on that, which is that people tend to think it's not going to happen to them. And I would say, I think that was one of the things about Newtown that really startled a lot of people, was here's this sleepy little upscale community where, if you've seen the documentaries lately, they have lots of the school band and concerts and picnics and that sort of thing, and then somebody comes in and wipes out 20 little kids, who the parents are suffering for a lifetime now. I think that really internalized a lot for mothers like Melissa, but I think that in general, a lot of people, we don't live in a war zone such as the type we might see on TV, Syria or whatever. So maybe people remove themselves from thinking it can happen to them. And then it does. For instance, the child who accidentally shoots himself, or a brother or sister, or the suicide, or in Milwaukee, the violence between gangs that ends up killing children and innocent people. So I think I think for one thing, we're numb. I think that it's happened, really horrible things have happened, and we think something's going to happen, and then nothing happens, like Newtown. And I think people feel, to some degree, powerless and a little bit numbed by it. And we've talked a lot about the danger, really, of normalizing this sort of thing, that we just accept these deaths. Well, the families who've lost a child, they're not going to accept this till the day they die.
I think there's more and more examples, unfortunately, of people who have been impacted by gun violence. And it's a hard thing to talk about. It's hard to heal yourself and also be an advocate for change. But there's been a turning point in our communities, and people are being really brave, and they're standing up and they're sharing their stories. Family members who have had small children who have been murdered sitting on their grandparents' laps, watching a movie at home. Kids that have gone to a dance club with their friends to let off steam and have some fun on a Saturday night. Mothers whose kids have committed suicide. Fathers whose daughters have gone to work at the grocery store and been executed in a parking lot. These people are standing up and they're saying, well, my story is tragic and painful. It's not unique. And we need to link arms and do something to address this public health crisis. And when we come together and raise our voices and give each other strength, and help people understand that you're not alone, we can beat out these special interest groups, and we can, in fact, affect policy in our Capitol buildings.
Now, both of you have mentioned a couple things. Therese, you said you've mentioned Newtown a couple times. You're talking about Sandy Hook Elementary there, and you talked about numbness, and you talked about the way that, Melissa, communities are impacted. Well, almost all of us now as Americans can go down this litany of names. We can say Columbine, or Charleston, or Fort Worth, or Fort Hood, or San Bernardino. Even here in Wisconsin, we have Oak Creek, where we had a massacre of gun violence. So it's almost this litany where we are so used to it now. Every year, somebody comes in with a gun in some city in America and opens fire. And it is numbing. And it almost is this point where we almost say, well, it just happens all the time. It doesn't even make the news anymore. But yet, when we hear the names of those places, we all know what we're talking about. Virginia Tech, all these places that have been affected by gun violence. And so in our American history now, we are developing this long roll of gun violence in communities in a place where we revere guns, and yet our cities are riddled with bullets and with fatalities because of it. And it's sad. It's something that as Americans we might begin to feel ashamed about, if you ask me.
Well, I certainly am ashamed, and I'm not going to allow it to be normal. It doesn't honor the lives that have been lost and the people who have been touched by this violence. It's important that we stand up against this and that we don't allow it to be just another event that happened today. When parents get an email that says your child's school is going to be closed tomorrow because of a feared threat, or when a parent gets an email that says our school's on lockdown, When a street is blocked off and you can't drive down it because there's an incident that's occurring and people don't even think twice or bat their eyes, that is not going to be, that's not okay. We cannot accept that as our normal. We have to continue to be uncomfortable by this public health crisis. We have to continue to be uncomfortable and demand that we can do better, not only for ourselves, but for our children and our shared future. And that doesn't mean that we have to give up our culture. That doesn't mean that we have to fight against our Constitution. But it means that the direction that we are moving in here in the state of Wisconsin and many other states across our nation, where we are repealing protections for our communities, is something that is more important now than ever to fight against.
You know, one thing that we as politicians struggle with, among many these days, is the idea that we're not supposed to talk about this. Because there will be people who will say that it's our party and we're going to take away guns and all of that. And I would argue that if we don't start having this conversation, it's just never going to happen. That we have to help embolden people in our communities who want this talked about, who have given up, frankly, on, as I said earlier, on Congress and on their legislature in terms of making a difference in their lives on this issue and many others. So it really is a case where I think it is time. It is time that we make it easier for people to talk about in communities and fight, disagree, or whatever, but start discussing it and not have the only body that is really the constant drumbeat be the special interests.
And it's a hard conversation to have, quite frankly. I've been outspoken, as has Therese and a number of our other colleagues, and I've had my home address put out on social media by organizations like the NRA. I don't know that it was directly them, but gun.com and other groups out there, my home address, encouraging people to come and scare me.
And I've had, and I think
I've
we've all
gotten phone calls
Yeah.
on my own phone, and I've got kids at home, right? I've had calls to my office. My staff has been harassed, and that type of bully behavior.
It's classic bullying.
It's terrifying, but it also, I'm not going to let them win. Right? I have to make sure that my kids and my family is safe, but it actually gives me more purpose in the work that I'm doing. Because, you know, at the end of the day, I want those people's kids to be safe too.
It is startling that it is so hard to have this discussion. And I think, as Melissa mentioned, one thing that does shut down, that is intimidating to politicians, is when we get the personal threats, if we even bring up the topic. And those people are out there, and they're very quick to react. And I think that after Newtown, when I made a remark about it on my state representative page, I started getting some vile comments from around the nation. And it was enough that a friend called and said, please take that posting down because I'm afraid for you. That's kind of hard. I mean, that makes you want, I mean, you know, I think that for some people it makes them want to back away. It can be scary, but, and I think maybe that's on a lower level of conflict, maybe what's happening in communities, people afraid to bring it up because somebody is going to attack them verbally. But I think, as Melissa said, and I've said before, we've got to get going on this conversation and not let it continue to be monopolized by the other side. Especially when we're talking about lives. I mean, if we really, in this country, believe that you have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the first one is life.
And to own a gun, though.
Oh, yeah. But I mean, you know, you've got to be alive. You've got to be alive, and when somebody is killed, that's it. They're gone. it's done. And I think sometimes we need to talk maybe more about, what are the consequences of that to the rest of the family and to that person, et cetera, as opposed to the right to own a gun. Well, I don't think that supersedes the right for people to feel safe in their own communities. I don't. And so let's have an argument about that. Why should I have to worry about being safe? Why should kids, grandchildren, why should they have to worry about safety and being shot? Some of the concept that they probably can't even fathom.
It's a scary thing, even
Yeah.
with since the concealed carry has been introduced in Wisconsin. People are allowed to put a sign on their door with a circle and a line through it saying, I don't want a gun in this space, right? But one of the, I've always appreciated the fact that businesses had those. I thought, I'm going to go to these businesses. But also as a mom who is carrying like pre-literate children, thinking my babies are being desensitized to this visual where we walk into places and they're seeing a picture of a gun, even though it has a line through it. It's everywhere. It's ingrained in our culture. And there has to be a better place, a better way that we can both honor our Second Amendment rights and our ability to be safe and secure in society. They don't have to be pitted against each other. Just because there's a rich group out there who wants to paint that picture to be the case doesn't mean that needs to be the way it is. And there is a wave moving across our state and our nation of people that are rising up passionately and saying, no more. I'm not going to stand for this. And we can do better. And quite frankly, a lot of it is impacted legislatively. We can't even talk about gun safety and technology in the way that we should be able to, because we're not able to study it at the federal level because of laws that have been drafted by...
That's a powerful lobbying group, isn't it?
They've been drafted by the NRA, right? And it's codified. And
even scientists are afraid to tackle
scientists
the issue.
are having a hard time.
They're being bullied.
That's right. So we're talking about doctors and science. And quite frankly, as Therese said, life is too valuable. And it's too short, quite frankly. And we know we can be doing better. And we know that the vast majority of the people in our state and our nation believe very much the way we do, that we need to change this narrative.
That issue of the line through the gun about concealed carry is one of the greatest ironies in this discussion of freedom to me, is that if I have a home, you as a gun carrier are free to bring your gun into my house without telling me, and I have to be the one to post a sign to say, you may not bring your gun into my house. I think that's a strange irony when you're talking about freedoms. And we've talked a lot on camera here. I want to ask you one last question. I'll ask you if you want to add anything else, but tell me about the legislation. Where is it at right now? How's it doing? What kind of backing do you have? Tell me about it.
Well, there are a number of bills. If you're talking about the background check bill, it usually just sits somewhere in the Republican leadership's office and doesn't get a hearing.
One of the difficult things in Wisconsin is we're not a state that says, okay, so you've introduced a piece of legislation for consideration, so we're going to give it a public hearing. The majority party has the ability to not ever allow it to be heard in a public forum. And
we do
that's
have
one of
some
our
other
challenges.
Yeah, we do have a number of other bills that are out there. Last session, we ended the 48-hour waiting period. That generally was a cooling off period that was put into law to help in reduce deaths from domestic violence. And that issue hasn't gone away. And the supporters of ending the 48-hour waiting period said, well, anybody can get a get a background check within minutes now, so we don't need to have that 48-hour waiting period. Well, that wasn't the point. The point was to stall people who were doing something in the heat of passion.
And unfortunately, within weeks of that bill being introduced, there were real examples in Wisconsin of people who admittedly wouldn't have committed a crime of murder if there had been a waiting period. People lost their lives because we repealed that.
The spa killing.
Well, in my district, the girl that was working at the grocery store.
Nozzle, okay.
There's a number of them that almost immediately after we start repealing these protections, people are they're losing their lives, and that doesn't even take into consideration suicide.
Have you ever heard of the 13-second rule? That's if somebody says something nasty to you, before you respond to them, you count off 13 seconds and you cool down and you decelerate the hostility.
I could use that when we're on the assembly floor. I'll remember that, thank you.
All right, so you have no Republican co-signers to the legislation you're proposing.
Well, I would add, as far as being fair here, that there are also Democrats who are either afraid or at least not willing to fight the battle now. So it in that way, it's bipartisan.
It's bipartisanly opposed. How is that?
Yeah, there are just, frankly, it is a hot button issue that a lot of people don't want to talk about. And so that's part of the numbness too, thinking, well, citizens get upset for a little while. I call it sort of the 3-week rule. It also seems to be the case with drunk driving deaths. It's in the news for about a 3-week period of what bad thing happened, and then the person they've caught, and maybe the court proceedings or whatever, and then by then the public has lost interest, and so the media moves on to something else. And maybe several months later you'll see some small news item of a follow-up. But
it's difficult. I mean, we lost a colleague last session
to suicide
of someone from the other side of the aisle, and that still wasn't enough to encourage change at the legislative level in this building. I am terrified to think of how bad it's going to have to get before we're able to impact this through the legislature. But it's clear that ordinary people across our state, in our communities, are they're done, and they are empowered, and they're in this building knocking on doors and sharing their stories, and they're taking on the special interest group of the NRA, and I think that that's an amazing thing that's happening. I think oftentimes public policy changes occur because the public is ahead of the legislature.
There's something that's going to be interesting to watch now, which is the gun lobbies won't have Obama or any Democrats to say they're coming for your guns. And so I'm not exactly sure how they're going to continue to scare people.
Well, that
But
jacket
there
has
will be.
100 legs. Don't worry about it.
I know. Well, and they are putting out some very, what I consider bizarre legislation now, that we should get rid of gun silencers. I think that they're hoping to just make a good clean sweep of everything they can while they have the control of Congress and most state legislatures. But at the same time, raising money. I don't know, like I said, I don't exactly know how they're going to scare people. But you're right. There'll be another horrible incident that they'll be able to use, and they will send their letters all over the country telling people you should be afraid and go get a gun if you don't have one now. So.
Well, Representatives Berceau and Sargent, I think you're courageous for taking on the NRA by yourself with your colleagues.
Gun lobby.
The gun lobby. All right. And I thank you for your time. Thank you for conversation.
Thanks.